How long does it take to realize you're on a pilgrimage? Our tour guide, Steve Ray, told us fairly early on that each of us may feel a bit of a spiritual impact on any given day of our travels. And for me, it started hitting when we visited the Mount of the Beatitudes.
Blessed are the sorrowing, for they shall be consoled. And the meek shall come to rule the world. Lead me, Lord, lead me, Lord.
Now, personally, I'll take a picturesque landscape over a majestic basilica any day. It's partially a matter of personal preference, and maybe it's because of my upbringing in the Pacific Northwest, but I've discovered a great attachment to these holy sites that are in nature. In fact, it was after a beautiful outdoor mass and 30 minutes of prayer that I realized I don't want to leave. And that's the thing, we don't have to. The whole point of pilgrimage is finding a place where we can more closely feel God, but then cultivating that feeling and bringing it into our daily lives. So I got out a journal and I drew out a bit of a game plan I figured I'd share with you. To me, good prayer, which is the key to sustaining relationship with God, is strict, creative, and communal. Now at first, a couple of those might seem a bit contradictory, but allow me to explain. Let's start with strict. So Jesus, in his sermon on the Beatitudes, clearly gives us a list of blessings for those who live according to his commandments. The Beatitudes, which are considered one of the major cornerstones of Christ's teaching, command us to be poor in spirit, to mourn, to be meek, to hunger and thirst for righteousness, be merciful, to be clean in heart, be peacemakers, and uncomfortably be persecuted. These are things we are all called to be, regardless of who we are and where we come from. And because humans are creatures of habit, it means to enter a state of meekness or righteousness, we need to practice. And that practice, as I've outlined in a couple of these other episodes, is surrender to God. It means establishing a regular, strict prayer regimen. It really is the only way we can reach any sort of spiritual enlightenment that all humans are called to in the Beatitudes. Now, because we differ in culture, background, and experience, my way of attaining such a state of spiritual enlightenment might be very different than someone else. Today we visited two important sites in terms of the church's authority. The first being the place of St. Peter's Confession, and the second being the place of his commissioning. In both places, Jesus gives Peter the authority to bind and loose people to certain practices. It basically means that Peter, and as the Catholic Church understands it, his successors have this authority to declare certain practices moral or immoral. When Jesus gave Peter the powers to bind and loose people to certain ways of life, believe it or not, but there is a bit of a creative element in that. Peter heard God's laws firsthand, but for all the questions that Jesus didn't get the opportunity to answer in his life, well, he had to come up with a bit of creativity to interpret Christ's message to guide his flock down the line. And that's what popes have continued to do for thousands of years. Now, not a lot of people are aware of this, but everyone is called to be a part of the priesthood of Christ, not just formally ordained priests. And while Jesus might have given us certain spiritual authorities to help us organize our lives, we can't all be theologians in the grand scheme of things. It is not the Pope's job to legislate how every single person's relationship with God ought to be defined. That would be a bit of a slap in the face to the creative element that God imbued in us. This is where I say that while a strict prayer schedule, having a designated time, a place that you can go to is important, it's just as important to craft a set of spiritual exercises that best foster your relationship with God. And as I've said in my series on magisterial authority in the Church, a static and overly rigid theology that fails to account for new historical situations or ways of thinking is a dead and useless theology. Likewise, when you're a child, there's certain ways of praying that work for you. When you're a teenager, that might be different. When you're in college, it might be different. And when you're married, that might be different. Just as different seasons in the history of humanity might call for different creative responses from the Pope, different stages in our life will require different spiritual habits. After all, the end goal is to have a relationship with God. But relationship with God isn't something that happens merely in our head. God has given us the gift of each other. He's given us the gift of a community, a history, a culture, the Catholic Church. This is where the feeding of the 5,000 comes in. Given the parallels between Jesus feeding 5,000 people with bread and God feeding thousands of the Israelites while they were starving in the desert, I think it's safe to say that one of the main takeaways from this event is our call to emulate Jesus by multiplying the graces he gives us. It means spiritually feeding everyone we meet. And yes, that is a difficult and intimidating task. In a very individualistic society, spirituality in general has taken on a very isolated tone. It's my relationship with God, it's my soul. Heck, there's a bit of a vulnerability in just approaching someone and asking them to pray for you. But it's something we're called to do. So, how does this look in my personal life? I'm not claiming it's a perfect model, but it's certainly drawn me closer into relationship with God. Strictness. Every day, 15 to 30 minutes before work and before bed, I make myself sit down or kneel down in front of some pictures of Christ, in front of a crucifix, and I have a few standard morning and night prayers that I read. They're the same prayers every day. As I said, repetition and consistency I think is very important. Psychologically speaking, it's very easy to associate things like art, music, media, etc. with certain feelings or practices. For example, growing up, every Sunday, we'd have a steak dinner, and in the background, we would play smooth jazz. As a result, every time I hear smooth jazz, I get a bit hungry. Likewise, when I sit down and I pray the same prayer every morning and every night, and in the morning, I play some Eastern Christian chant, and at night, I play some Gregorian chant. Sun rises in the east, sets in the west. It instinctively puts me into this state of spiritual openness and vulnerability to whatever God might want to say to me. Like I said, the point of this is to get your body and mind in the zone of prayer. Here's where creativity enters in, at least for me. Some of the greatest saints and founders of religious orders have what they call rules that they developed over time. There's the rule of St. Francis, the rule of St. Benedict. They're more or less lists of things that you ought to say and do and think throughout the day. I think that's a brilliant model. In my opinion, I think every human being should have their own rule that they discern given their specific challenges throughout the day. So I've got a list of mantras, more or less, that I can repeat to myself throughout the day. They serve as reminders for what can keep me close to God throughout the day whenever there's a challenge. As far as the communal aspect is, I keep a literal prayer list. I know this is fairly common with a lot of Catholics, but I cannot stress how important it is. When you tell someone you're going to pray for them, write it down and let them know. Ronald Rolheiser, my favorite spiritual theologian, stresses that one of the most important parts of praying for anybody is letting them know that. Prayer doesn't change God's mind. Prayer is the recognition of a need or a desire in your life and surrendering that desire over to God's will. Prayer becomes communal, in my opinion, when you let the person know that you are thinking of them, that you are supporting them, that you are with them in spirit, and that they are a part of the body of Christ. Think of it like this. Any good athlete is going to have a strict workout schedule. They'll wake up at certain times every day, and certain exercises, maybe warm-ups and cool-downs, will remain consistent. But depending on the sport they play and depending on the muscle that needs work, they might shake things up a bit. Sometimes they'll work on biceps, sometimes they'll work on quads, triceps, whatever. But no good athlete keeps their training to themselves. The best athletes support each other, whether that be sharing workouts with each other or giving each other encouraging words, That's pretty much what I've got for you guys today. Special thanks again to Steve and Janet Ray's Footprints of God Pilgrimages for again giving me the opportunity to experience God's graces on an incredible level. As I said, the ultimate goal of any pilgrimage should be the transformation of one's life when we get out of the pilgrimage. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. God bless you.